Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Vilo Weiss, who is the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Indiana Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have here with us Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We have also Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's an Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here with us. Looking forward to our show. You know, one of the things that we're starting to notice on a worldwide basis is there are religious restrictions that are actually starting to increase. We have various faith traditions that are being experienced in many different areas of the world, and the tensions seem to be very high. In Europe, for example, in countries like France and Austria and Denmark, we're starting to see a targeting of Islam. In a country like Nicaragua, you know, the country is in Central America, they're targeting Catholic clergy for supporting pro-democracy movements. In other parts of the world, we see that there are groups that are constantly pushing away from what they used to believe and now going after groups like Christians. Even in Africa, and specifically in Nigeria, we've seen a lot of different things going on where even in the court systems, they are ruling against Christians. You know, Bettina, you have been in a unique position in which you've had a chance to work, for example, in areas of religious freedom from a worldwide perspective, as well as here in the North American region of the world. But when you see all of this stuff happening and the spiking that's starting to take place as we move into different parts of the world on this particular topic, what is this telling us and what should we be cautious of? And is there possibly something that we should be doing even if you're not experiencing those particular areas of tension?
Well, you know, Orlin, I always think that reports like this remind me that religious persecution is a lot like inflation, because we all agree it's a problem. We know we can track it, we can describe the problem, but no one really knows what to do to make those rates go down. And a study like this, I mean, it's both eye-opening in terms of the scope of religious persecution across the world, but it's also kind of numbing, because when you see the extent of the problem, you're almost tempted to throw up your hands and say, what can we do? You know, I had an opportunity to interview the chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, Abraham Cooper, just a couple of months back. And I said to him, you know, in your years at the commission, what have you learned about religious freedom and religious persecution that you didn't know before? And he said to me, what I learned is that the situation globally is much more dire than anyone is prepared to either acknowledge or to deal with.
Wow.
And that the resources that we need, especially here in the US, to really effectively try to affect those rates in a meaningful way, we just don't have those resources. We need at least 10 times the amount of resources that we currently have. So, you know, a report like this, sobering, but, you know, I'm not sure that it gives us concrete steps forward for addressing what it describes.
You know, this movement, you know, to restrict religion in various ways around the world is interesting, because we supposedly are living in an age of enlightenment. You know, we've never had more access to information. We've never had more higher levels of education. But yet we're becoming, in many senses, more barbaric. We're going back to the past again. And that's, you know, that's very, very troublesome to me. Instead of respecting each other, if we don't like you, what you believe, we're going to get rid of you. It's a sad commentary for where we've come.
Well, you know, the interesting thing when you think about this, Jennifer, is the fact that these numbers many people don't focus on. We're talking about 160 countries, up from 155 countries. So in other words, we're trending in the wrong direction in terms of where we're seeing this taking place. And I'm just wondering if there's a messaging issue on a worldwide basis, because it's not like it's centralized to Europe or centralized to the continent of Africa. It's smattering that's taking place everywhere, which makes me wonder, is the information age part of the problem?
No, and I think that that's part of the issue, Orlin. This is not localized to just one area or to one part of the globe. This is a global issue, and one thing I found interesting about the study is that it's not like it's just one faith tradition that's been targeted either. There are people of all different faiths being targeted around the globe, whether that's Christians or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists or whatever it is. And I think that part of it is a messaging issue. These restrictions and the harassment is not just government restrictions, but there's also social hostilities that are taking place as well. And I think that there's definitely a messaging aspect to that, where we have social hostilities against minority religions. And, in some instances, like in majority Muslim countries, it might be against Christians, and in Christian majority countries, it might be against Muslims or people of the Jewish faith. And so we have to do a better job of understanding the importance of respecting all faith traditions and those who don't have a faith tradition also.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I also think that there is a part of this, partly that Bettina referenced. Not only is this different religious traditions in different parts of the world, right? Different regions with different context. There's also, we can't just lump it into religious persecution in perhaps a nationalistic or government way, right? I mean, you can look at Prime Minister Modi and the BJP, Hindu nationalism group, right, in India, that I think is carefully watched right now. Just had a re-election. Prime Minister Modi is re-elected, but his party lost, right? It shrunk in India, partly because it seems from polling, because of the attitude of Hindu nationalists towards the other groups, not just Muslim groups in the country, but the wide diversity of traditions. But that isn't the only model in which this happens, right? As Jennifer just said, a lot of this is on-the-ground groups that in their identity marker and their worry of the other, right, national or international immigration trends have a lot to do with this, right, worldwide economies, this worry that somehow we, whoever the we is being threatened by the they, right, this other that's going to come over and ruin our group, ruin our country, they're the bad guys. And that, we like to talk about that really locally, if not regionally or nationally, but that is true also internationally in the same local and regional and national states. And it gets really complicated because it's all involved with people, and we tend to be quite messy.
It's interesting, just as you've said, Andy, religious persecution is not a monolithic experience across the globe. It's varied. And I think complicating this whole picture is the fact that there are also new forms or new methods, methodologies of persecution. And prime example, China and its development of a surveillance state using technology. It has, over the decades, developed various forms of surveillance, facial recognition, control over the financial sector that allows it to control its citizens. And more than that, it is exporting this technology to other countries in the region who also have an interest in the domestic control of their own citizens. Countries such as Pakistan, North Korea, Myanmar, other authoritarian states. And I think that aspect is one that we really need to get our minds around and need to grapple with, because it adds a dimension that is particularly troubling and also particularly difficult to engage with, to combat.
But Jennifer, one of the things that I find interesting is that when you look at some of the groups that are being put upon, even when we were talking about some of the activities in Nigeria, there would be this assumption that there's not a large Christian population in Nigeria, that this is something that's squeezing in on, quote unquote, the minority religion in that area. But there's a large number of Christians in Nigeria, and the court systems there were willing to actually, make decisions that were penalizing that group. So it's not even like the majority is ruling. It just seems like religion in many walks of the world seem to just be, having a bad reputation. And for some reason, folk are comfortable with penalizing them without any concern as to what the backlash may be.
No, you're right. And, something I found interesting in what Bettina was saying, and is that there's not a one size fits all as far as how these restrictions take place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just states that have a state religion where we see this persecution taking place or these hostilities taking place. It's also in highly secular societies where there might be social hostilities towards religion. It's also in societies that call themselves, democracies where we see hostilities taking place. And so we have to be aware of all the different ways that these hostilities are taking place. And it's not, like you said, only against minority religions, right? There are sometimes very minority groups with very loud voices, where they're willing to take extreme actions that are also causing some of the hostilities that we're seeing.
Andrew, you've written on this topic, and the thing that I find interesting is that I believe if you poll most of the people in the world and ask them, are you in favor of religion or against religion, I would assume the majority of the world would say they are in favor of religion. But that same group that says that they're in favor of religion are also part of the dynamic that's actually, putting upon this quote unquote, pressure on religious groups. It almost seems as though if your religion doesn't look like my religion, then that's where the problem comes into play.
That's right. Yeah, and often that doesn't seem to be particularly theological or doctrinal, right? You have the wrong ritual. It seems to be you are an other, you are the dangerous, right? Social theorists have worked about this for a long time. One of my favorite guy named Talal Assad talked about how religion in some sense was created, this broad category that means virtually nothing to us, right? I mean, it encompasses so much. It was created at the same time we need to create identities of nation states that are lines on a map that have very little to do with language and culture and the way we do, right? As humans expand and group more and more, we have a language that we use to describe who we are and who they are. And religion is also a part of that, even when it becomes nonsensical. So often what we call religious, right, the ritual, the rites, the food movements, the clothing, the theology, the doctrine, it's not necessarily those individually religious issues that are involved. It is a religion, which is a word for a group, that is a problem. And the language we use often doesn't actually describe the things that we're doing and what we mean, and it makes the whole thing a little bit messy.
Viola, what I find very interesting is you look at some of these areas, you go to the Netherlands and they're funding, religious schools there. Then you go to Denmark, which is actually not that far away, and then you've got this completely different persecution taking place. It's not even like you're looking at huge regions. Sometimes you're basically traveling 100 miles in a new direction, and all of a sudden you've got a whole different set of pressures that are happening. I don't know if we were talking a little bit about the impact of the information age, but it seems as though hate travels as well on the information age as anything else.
And here we have countries that have a long history of having an established church in these countries, but yet they're dealing with societal issues very, very differently. It's a new day.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, but I got to say that as we continue to look at what's going on a worldwide basis, I think the idea that we as Americans sometimes feel that we are protected and insulated in some way, when the fact of the matter is that injustice for one still needs to be injustice for all. And I hope that as we continue this dialogue, that we will get to a point where not only Americans, but people from all walks of life understand that we can peacefully coexist. You can serve your God the way you see fit and never have to worry about me coming after you because it's not similar. There was a court case that's called Carmack versus Janny et al. And in that particular case, we see that in the United States District Court for the Federal District of Colorado, there was a ruling that a man whose parole officer sent him back to jail for refusing to take part in religious worship and activities is now proceeding to trial, and we are now looking at the possibility of damages, punitive damages, and other issues that may be taking place as a result of an individual who believes that his First Amendment rights were violated because, quote unquote, he is an atheist and didn't think that this was something that should be required of him. One of the things that I'm kind of noticing is that as we keep going through the court systems, we find ourselves pushing up against the basic rights of individuals who seem to be in a position where they don't feel free from the activities of the state. The state seems to be pushing them in a certain direction. And as Christians, we may be happy to hear that people are pushing people towards maybe going to worship services, that it should be a better place, and we'll all be better people if we engage with that. But the Constitution also protects individuals who want to have no religious affiliations, who do not want to engage in worship. And sometimes we're right back to the idea where you look a little too different from me, and therefore there's a problem. You know, Jennifer, when you look at this particular case and you see a situation where somebody looks like they're being mandated maybe to engage in worship, and the willingness to push back from it can sometimes end up causing issues from a legal perspective, I guess I got to ask the question, you know, is this getting a little bit too out of the norm? Or is it impossible to separate somebody who has personal beliefs that my Christianity can be helpful to you and hope that they would be able to separate it in some way from a work perspective?
Well, you know, Orlin, I really appreciate that the 10th Circuit recognized that that we have a basic human right to be free from state-sponsored religious coercion. And if we look at the facts of this case, at least as presented on the papers, we see that there's this individual, this parolee, who was forced to go to a rehabilitation center that has a Christian program, right? It's called, I think, Steps to Success or something of that nature. And there are worship services, there's religious counseling, there are Bible studies, and this is mandated for this person to attend or go back to jail. And if that's not state-sponsored coercion to tell someone either attend and participate in these programs or go back to jail, I really don't know what is. And this individual signed on to abide by the House rules before knowing what they were. On the first day, tells the director, I'm an atheist, this is against my beliefs. And they tell him, basically, we don't care, right? And it's not just the program director, but it's also the parole officer who also happened to be at least friends of some sort here. It was less than a week before he was told to leave the program for failing to comply. And I think that they knew from the beginning that this individual was not going to comply with these requirements, given the fact that he's an atheist. They even went further to tell him that he couldn't even tell anyone that he was an atheist or to share his beliefs. So we have, coercion, and then also we have this infringement on his ability for free speech, right? To tell him you can't speak your beliefs or your values here if you don't want to go to jail. So I'm glad the 10th Circuit has said, okay, this can move forward, and that the parolee, this individual, is able to at least pursue recovering damages for this injustice that occurred.
Yeah, often on this program, we look at cases, events, issues that are really talking about the fine line, right, between politics and religion, of faith and coercion, right? They're difficult and they're messy. This is not one of those to me at all. Like, as Jennifer just clearly laid out, not only is this explicitly state-sponsored religion, even from the faith part of it, I cannot think of a more unchristian thing than you must go to worship service or we will put you in jail. It is antithetical to the gospel as I understand it, and completely contrary to the First Amendment, every part we have. So I must say, in a weird way, it's kind of nice that this is so clear cut, right? You just can't do this. If we have freedom of religion, this falls against every definition, no matter the complexity and messiness of that.
Can we just acknowledge the irony here that we have just been talking about international persecution, where Christians around the world are being told, you've got to choose between Jesus or jail. And here we have a Christian telling an atheist, you've got to choose between Jesus or jail. I mean, it is, when you think about it in those terms, there is no more clear-cut example of religious coercion. I was interested in reading some of the documents around this case. Apparently, Mr. Janny, he said, this has no place in America. And he was absolutely spot on. I mean, that is the case. Something like this has no place in America. Unfortunately, those who are representing the defendants in this case are a Christian legal advocacy organization, and they're making the case that it infringes on the missions, the rescue missions, religious freedom to have to change their religious identity in any way to, accommodate an atheist. I find that troubling. because it is a distortion of what religious liberty really means. And I think it also provides an example of why religious freedom claims these days are being greeted with more and more skepticism by Americans. I think we need to guard against that.
You know, Viola, one of the things, though, that I find interesting about this whole concept is that many of the counseling principles that sometimes you are sent to from a court-mandated standpoint actually have underlying what I would call biblical teachings, you know, teaching you to go someplace and to learn how to, you know, get along with individuals. And I'm just wondering, is the fact that he was called to have to engage in, quote unquote, a worship service or something that you would deem to be biblically based, you know, the real problem, as opposed to if I had asked you to go someplace where it was going to be, you know, counseling to allow you to be a more productive individual or work better with other people in society, some would say that's basically doing what Jesus would have you to do. But if you take that out of it, then maybe what this was more a title of a problem as opposed to the underlying messaging of what they wanted him to do to really be a problem. Or am I missing something here?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that as I read this case, that the Denver Rescue Mission was very offered a very overt Christian program, and now there are lots of good principles that undergird Christianity that they could have done. They could have emphasized those things without the worship aspects and the Christian aspects, but they could undergird those basic principles, and they wouldn't have had any problem. But you know, here you have a guy that's a state officer that's violating the free exercise of religion of Mark Janny, and that just flies in the face of the Constitution.
You know, I'm amazed that this has to find itself at the 10th Circuit, and I would make the assumption what may happen there will lead to decisions that we won't have any concerns with. But I would not be surprised if we find ourselves even flying further up, you know, and having decisions that are made that may be saying, you know something, if you had a little bit of good Christianity in your life, maybe you wouldn't find yourself as part of the penal system. And I'd love to say that I could never imagine a judge saying that, but today, I don't know if I could ever make that statement that I would never imagine a judge saying that. So it makes me wonder, you know, where might we be going? Maybe this is more of a set up for a potential next step as opposed to simply looking at a state of what we are right now and thinking that it's just overboard. You know, I don't know, Andrew, what do you think about that? Because it seems as though these changes that take place start with a small increment, then they move up to another increment, and the next thing you know, you find yourself with a 9-0 decision somewhere at the top level.
Yeah, I think the voluntary, in this case, explicitly involuntary nature of this is what is the crux of the matter, right? We can believe, I assume probably everyone here on the panel believes that, right, education in the life of Jesus and the way of the Christians in the world is a helpful, beneficial thing for humanity. But when the state says you must do it, that's not the same thing, right? It's like Bettina was referencing before. The troubling part of this is the idea of the defense of it is where we're Christian. And so for you to tell us we can't make them be Christian is religious persecution. That is highly troubling, right? And this reversal that is talked about a bunch of times. Andrew Wong, who's another guest on the show, has eloquently talked about it before. Right, the idea of religious freedom was intended to be a shield, a legal shield, and now it's being wielded as a sword. Right, my religious faith is my religious faith, and you can't keep me from persecuting people. You can't keep me because of my faith from leaving people out or discriminating people. That is not what religious freedom is. That is religious persecution by another name. So it's that crux that I think is the difficult term for me.
Yeah, and I think it's disingenuous, like, as you said, for this center to say, well, you're persecuting me by not allowing us to run the program the way we want to, right? They could easily say, no, we're not going to accept someone from day one who's not going to adhere by these rules. But they had him sign the paper first that he's going to abide by these house rules, and then they told him what the house rules are. So, you know, that to me is a little bit disingenuous there. Right. They did not have to accept this individual. And to tell me that this was the only place he could reside in the greater Denver area or Fort Collins area also, then there's a problem with finding providers that can take all individuals that aren't specifically faith-based, right? That should not be the parolees' problem. That should be an issue for the system to have to find centers that are able to take all people.
And Bettina, this looks like the same issues we talk about. Here we have a state of Colorado that on one hand seems to be so liberal as it relates to certain things, as it relates to, marijuana use, as it relates to whether or not you want to protect individuals who want to quote unquote engage in, in making cakes only for a specific group of individuals. But then on the other hand, you've got this other situation where you're telling an atheist, oh, no, you're going to do this. I mean, it's almost like even within your same house, you've got multiple things going on where you have no idea what to expect.
Well, we are part of a pluralistic society. That's both a blessing and it can be a difficulty, a challenge, as we try to work through our differences and try to work out ways to live peacefully together. But one thing is for sure, the way to deal with pluralism is not to try to impose your particular beliefs on another group or another individual. Pluralism works, and it has worked in the United States for many, many years by allowing individuals to live out their deepest convictions without coercion and with the protection of the law.
And I think the protection of Janny by the 10th Circuit probably pinpointed that exact same concept. We need to protect people from the law, and we need to protect people in spite of who they may have to engage with that may be in violation of the law. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
You know that the New York governor back during the COVID era actually gerrymandered districts to specifically impact Jewish believers.
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlan, did you know that the modern parole system has Australian roots? The very first parole system was instituted in 1840 on an island just off the coast of Australia that was being used to hold convicts. Not sure if this is something good, but I'm going to claim it.
Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that though the U.S. contains just above 4% of the world population, we have just over 21% of the incarcerated population of the entire world?
Wow, that's sad to hear. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So do you know that according to a recent Gallup poll, Americans are becoming less and less trusting of pastors and other clergy? In fact, less than 1/3 of American adults think of pastors as either highly honest or ethical. But that still puts pastors higher than politicians and lawyers, if that's any consolation.
Well, no comment on that one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. It was a great show today. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.